Every Sunday, in hundreds of thousands of churches across America, a familiar ritual takes place. An offering plate or bag is passed down the pews, and before it's passed, the pastor will often deliver a short message, a reminder of the importance of giving. That message frequently centers on one specific, powerful concept: the tithe. The word itself, from Old English, simply means a tenth, and the teaching is one of the most ingrained and clearly understood principles. In modern American Christianity, believers are called, or even commanded, by God to give 10% of their income, their first fruits, to the local church. This is presented as a fundamental, non-negotiable act of faith. We're told it's a matter of obedience, of trusting God with our finances, of robbing God if we fail to do it. A charge taken directly from the prophet Malachi chapter 3, "Will man rob God? Yet you are robbing me." But you say, "How have we robbed you?" In your tithes and contributions, bring the full tithes into the storehouse. This seems like an open and shut case. The Bible commands a 10% tithe. It's the baseline for Christian giving. But what if I told you that this entire system is based on a profound misunderstanding of what the biblical tithe actually was? What if I told you the original tithe was not money, but food? What if it wasn't just 10%, but closer to 23%? What if it wasn't a charitable donation at all, but a national agricultural tax to fund a specific theocratic government? And what if the New Testament, the foundational text for Christianity, is almost completely silent on commanding Christians to tithe, and instead offers a radically different model of giving? Today, we are going to open the ledger on one of the most sensitive and foundational practices in the modern church. We will trace the surprising history of the tithe. From an ancient tax on crops to a modern offering of income, is the 10% tithe a timeless biblical command? Or is it a modern man-made invention? To understand the modern tithe, we must first go back to the source. The concept appears long before the law of Moses, in the book of Genesis. First, we see Abraham in Genesis 14. After rescuing his nephew Lot, he meets Melchizedek, king of Salem and a priest, and gives him a tenth of everything. Then, in Genesis 28, Jacob has his famous vision of a ladder to heaven and makes a vow, saying, "Of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you." Modern proponents of tithing often point to these pre-law examples as proof that the 10% tithe is a timeless, universal principle, established by the patriarchs before the Mosaic law was ever given. But historians and biblical scholars are quick to point out that these two instances are descriptive, not prescriptive. They are one-time events. Abraham gives a tenth of his spoils of war, not his regular income. Jacob vows to give a tenth in the future, conditional on God's blessing and protection. Neither passage establishes a standing, universal command for all people for all time. The actual command for tithing comes much later, as a core part of the law of Moses, given specifically to the nation of Israel. And when you look at what this tithe actually was, it looks almost nothing like what we practice today. 1. The tithe was agricultural, not financial. The commands in books like Leviticus 27 minutes and 30 seconds, and Deuteronomy 14:22-23 are explicit: every tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's, and every tithe of herds and flocks. The tithe was a 10% tax on the agricultural produce of the land of Israel. It was not a tithe on a stonemason's income, a tentmaker's profits, or a soldier's wages. It was a farm-totable system, not a cash-based one. 2. It was a theocratic tax, not a donation. This is the most crucial distinction. The nation of Israel was a theocracy, a nation-state ruled by God, with a functioning government and civil service. Who was that civil service? The tribe of Levi. The Levites, including the priests, the sons of Aaron, were the religious, judicial, and administrative class. But, by divine command, they were not given any land inheritance in Israel. So, how were they to survive? How was the entire temple system, the sacrifices, the festivals, the judiciary to be funded? The tithe, the 10% agricultural tithe, given by the other 11 tribes, was, in effect, the national income tax that paid the salaries of the Levites, who in turn gave a tenth of that tithe to the priests. This wasn't a charitable donation you gave if you felt good about it. It was a mandatory tax for funding the entire government and religious infrastructure. 3. It was probably not just 10%. The system described in the Old Testament is actually far more complex than a single 10% offering. Scholars identify at least 2, and possibly 3 separate tithes. The Levitical tithe, the 10% tax on produce given to the Levites, Numbers 18. The festival tithe, a second 10% Deuteronomy 14:22-27, that the family was to take themselves to Jerusalem, to be eaten in a joyous celebratory feast before the Lord. The poor tithe, every 3rd year. The festival tithe was instead kept in the local town and given to the Levites. The foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows, a form of social welfare, Deuteronomy 14:28-29. If you add this up, the average Israelite was giving not 10%, but closer to 22-23% of their produce annually to this complex system of funding the government, the national festivals, and the social welfare program. This system is what the prophet Malachi was addressing. When he wrote, "Will man rob God? In your tithes," he was speaking to 5th century BCE Jews who had returned from exile and were failing to pay the required national tax. The storehouse was the temple treasury. The priests and Levites were starving, the temple was falling into disrepair, and the entire covenant system was collapsing. Malachi was rebuking them for defrauding the temple tax system, not scolding a 21st century American for failing to give 10% of their paycheck to a local non-profit church. This Old Testament system are mandatory, agricultural, 20% plus tax to fund a national theocracy continued right into the time of Jesus. Jesus himself speaks of tithing, but only a few times, and most famously, to critique the religious leaders. In Matthew 23:23, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done, without neglecting the others." This is a fascinating verse. Jesus doesn't abolish the tithe. He and his audience were still ethnic Jews living under the Mosaic covenant, and the temple was still standing. He affirms they should do it. But he drastically relativizes it, calling it one of the least important parts of the law, a complete distraction compared to the weightier matters of justice and mercy. But after Jesus' death and resurrection, and especially after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, everything changes. The entire Levitical system, the priesthood, the sacrifices, the temple ceases to exist. The object of the tithe, the storehouse, is gone. The recipients of the tithe, the Levitical priesthood, are dispersed. So, what do the apostles, like Paul, Peter, and John, instruct the new, non-Jewish, non-theocratic, international Christian church to do? We are confronted with a deafening silence. Not once, in all the letters of the New Testament written to instruct the new churches, is the command to tithe 10% ever mentioned. It's simply gone. Instead, a completely new model for giving is introduced. It's not a tax, it's a gift. It's not compulsory, it's voluntary. It's not a percentage, it's proportional and joyful. The key text is 2 Corinthians 9:6-7. Paul is raising money for the poor church in Jerusalem. He writes, "The point is this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver." This is a radical shift in paradigm. New percentage. Paul gives number 10% rule. He just says bountifully. No compulsion. He explicitly forbids giving reluctantly or under compulsion. This is the opposite of a mandatory tax. Motive is key. The deciding factor is the heart, the cheerfulness of the giver. The New Testament model is one of grace, giving, or stewardship. Believers are encouraged to be generous, sacrificial, and cheerful. supporting the poor and the work of the gospel, giving proportionally as they have been prospered, but the fixed 10% mandate is absent. So, if the New Testament and the early church replaced the tithe with grace giving, how did the 10% rule make such a powerful comeback that millions of Christians now believe it's a core New Testament command? The answer, like so many aspects of modern American religion, is found in the 19th century. 1. Early church history. For centuries, the church was funded in various ways: spontaneous gifts, property endowments, and eventually, in Europe, by state-sponsored systems. The concept of the tithe was sometimes spiritualized, giving 1/10 of your life, or reintroduced in the medieval period as a civil tax to support the state church, much like the original. 2. The American experiment. After the American Revolution, the new Constitution disestablished the church. For the first time, churches were on their own. They were no longer funded by the state. They had to rely entirely on voluntary donations. 3. The Second Great Awakening and the Stewardship Movement. In the 1800s, America was on fire with religious revivalism. At the same time, new, independent denominations were exploding. These churches, all competing for dollars in a free market system, needed a simple, effective, and biblical-sounding fundraising model. 4. The invention of the 10% income, tithe. Revivalists and early stewardship pioneers began to heavily promote the 10% tithe. They brilliantly took the Old Testament concept, stripped it of its messy agricultural tax context, and repackaged it as a simple modern rule for the average person. Give 10% of your paycheck. This new income tithe was a fundraising miracle. It was simple, easy to understand, easy to calculate. Authoritative. It sounded like a direct command from God, using the powerful language of Malachi, "Don't rob God." Effective. It set a high, clear bar for giving, far higher than most people would give, spontaneously. This American innovation, this 19th century reinvention of an ancient law, became the standard. Default teaching in most evangelical and Baptist churches, taught so consistently that generations of believers now assume it was always the Christian practice. So, we have a clear, and perhaps for some, a disruptive history. The patriarchal tithe, Abraham, was descriptive, not prescriptive. The Old Testament tithe was a mandatory, 20% plus, agricultural tax to fund the government and social welfare system of the theocratic nation of Israel. The New Testament never commands this tithe. Instead, teaching a new model of voluntary, cheerful, proportional grace giving. The modern 10% tithe on income is largely a 19th century American invention, created as an effective fundraising model for voluntary churches. This historical data does not forbid giving 10%. Many find it a wonderful spiritual discipline, but it fundamentally reframes the nature of the practice. And this brings us to the final, crucial debate. How should a modern believer view the 10% tithe? On one side, argument A, is the 10% tithe a timeless spiritual principle? Is it a transcovenantal model of stewardship, first modeled by Abraham, later codified for Israel, and now carried on by the church as a God-ordained starting point for generosity? Is 10% just the training wheels for giving? A blessed discipline that demonstrates our trust in God and our commitment to His work, even if it's not a salvation issue. On the other side, argument B. Or, is the modern one, 0% tithe, a form of Christian legalism? Is it a dangerous misapplication of an expired Old Testament tax law, incorrectly applied to New Covenant believers? Does it, by its very nature, put people under compulsion, replacing the New Testament's call for joyful, heartfelt generosity with a rigid mathematical rule that often induces guilt and serves primarily as a reliable fundraising tactic for religious institutions? What do you think? When your church passes the offering plate, what is the true biblical standard for giving? Let me know your thoughts, respectfully, in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into the hidden history of the tithe fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content that uncovers the real stories behind our most familiar religious practices. Thanks for watching.